Ideologies are great. Maybe not historically, but you know what I'm referring to. The things that make me hard. Ignore that. My job today is to settle the debate once and for all on which ideology is the best in Rise of Nations, between fascism, communism and democracy. There are also 4 other ideologies, but they aren't really up to par compared to the first 3 I just mentioned. And the reason is simple. They are not as powerful. Let me explain in an American analogy, because most of my audience is American. Think of it this way. Nationalism, liberalism, socialism, non-aligned, they are a handgun. They are stable, but they don't have a lot of firepower. But fascism, democracy and communism, they are a shotgun. They are fucking powerful, but they have a lot of recoil. So it's about how you use it. They are all good in their own way, but the other 3 are just better. Except liberalism, it's not good at all. It's disgusting. Anyways, you probably need a background check on all the 3 different ideologies and what they are specifically good at. But before that, allow me to switch to a more comfortable attire. Allow me to introduce you to democracy, aka the nation that does nothing the entire game but somehow becomes number 1. This ideology is good at one thing, and one thing only: staying out of war like the little coward you are. Of course, we know that is not the case, since we have a lot of United States players that liberate Europe. But those people are an exception, since they are just a bunch of dicks. Can I use that word? Democracy is at its best when it's just staying still and not going to any wars, but it's virtually useless at everything else. It gains a military upkeep increase every time they build an army, it's 15%, that is fucking huge. They also get a stability decrease every time they declare a war that is not a liberation war, so conquest or subjugation, which makes them useless at invading and conquering stuff, and they also don't get a stability increase like the other 2 ideologies, which is a huge addition, because each percent of stability gives you an increase in percent in tax, manpower, etc. And all of these are reasons why people usually discard this ideology as the best and instead focuses on fascism versus communism. So let's go over them. This is fascism. It makes military inexpensive. Having a military being cheaper means more units reaching the manpower limit faster, and having money left means prioritizing cost of unit instead of manpower cost, which leads to tank spam and naval spam, which leads to Germany having Europe as its personal playground. And then we have communism, which will give you a fucking seizure. That should be a good enough background check of all the ideologies, I think. I don't know. I made a similar video like this in the past, which made a lot of communist mains upset. But I mean, it was understandable. I was just shitting and taking a fat dump on communism for like 12 minutes straight, instead of, you know, doing what I stated in the title. That's why I'm here today, to retake my statement on communism being inferior to fascism. Yeah, obviously not, but I'll entertain the idea, especially now since there have been leaks on new policies and people like to argue that these are somehow going to make communism the most broken ideology in the game, because they require resources produced from factories. And let me tell you, no, they're not. Wanna know why? Because everyone can build factories at the beginning of the game, and everyone also gets factory output too, because of the consumer goods strat. And every type of resource is abundant in the game, so everyone will be able to get the required amount for the electronic factories and the fertilizer factories. The only one I would actually see a problem with is the motor parts factories, but they aren't necessarily a advantage for communism. It's more like an advantage of location. If you have tungsten, you will get the policy. If you don't have tungsten, you won't get the policy. As simple as that. But I mean, sure, you only have to build 1 factory instead of 2.5. That's better. But that's not really what you're here for today. You want to know which ideology is the best in the game, and I'll be using around 4 criterias. Economy/military power, which involves your normal economy and your economy during wartime, and also some military factors like manpower gain. Then we have skill, and lastly, availability, which isn't really that important, but it's an interesting factor that I will entertain, so why not go over that one first? So, what do I mean by availability? Well, how easy is it to obtain your ideology? There's things like forcibly changing your ideology through subjugation wars or liberation wars, political power, and just straight up starting with your ideology, which is why democracy is obviously the best in this aspect. I mean, come on, who in their right mind thought it was a good idea to give the strongest nations in the game a fully maxed out ideology? The real question is between fascism and communism, which are pretty equal. Sure, communism can be obtained by doing a clever trick of justifying a liberation war or subjugation war against an already communist nation. But 1, it's pretty much luck if it's a player or not, you're wasting very precious early justification time, and if you're doing it later, it is not worth it. But I guess it's kind of easier to obtain, so I'll let them have this one. Economy though. Oh, before me, I have two examples. Let's use the early game one first. Germany is nationalist and Russia is communist. The reason why I didn't give Germany fascism, because I want to simulate the early game, and I don't want to bully communism down to oblivion, as you'll see soon. They both have pretty much equal population, they are also selling 100 consumer goods each to simulate the early game, and I've removed the debuff you get after forcibly switching ideology for Russia. I've also given Russia the best possible policies, while Germany has none. And Russia is still only able to afford 9.8 thousand tanks compared to Germany's 13.2 thousand tanks. Quite a substantial difference. Just look at when we go to war, and once again, I'll give them the advantage by letting them entrench. And even then, Russia still gets destroyed. And no, before you ask, Germany barely gains any war exhaustion, even though I killed my entire army, since 10k isn't that much. You'll gain much less war exhaustion in real games, since you will take your enemies by surprise. Hopefully. I don't know if you're good at the game or play like an actual monkey, but I'll assume the former. It'll also probably be much easier. I doubt most Russia players would manage to get 9.8 thousand tanks. Most will just see the declaration pop up, select all cities, then go, ooh, big shiny red button, me click, and boom, global warming. Okay, I may have been a bit harsh on communism, and I apologize. For not being harsh enough, come suck my ball! Before me, I have example 2. The endgame. Everything is pretty much maxed out. Best policies, modifiers, etc. And I'm switching between the 3 different ideologies as China. Every single ideology can afford factories in every city, kind of. It's just that every ideology that is not communism has to buy 20 to 30% more resources, which isn't really that big of a deal. Anyways, this is the basic income for all of them without an army. As you can see, resource incomes, which includes factory and normal resource income, isn't that substantial compared to tax income. Also, factory income, which a lot of communist mains likes to argue is superior to tax income, is barely important. It's barely over half the resource income shown. China has 393 cities, and let's assume every factory gives the maximum amount of 250,000 income, since the factories do that. That's only 98 million out of the total 171 million resource income. And the difference between the different ideologies' income isn't that substantial, except that democracy is doing what democracy does best, the IRS. But let's slowly start incorporating the army and see how many infantry troops they can afford. And oh god, it's not even close. Ignore the numbers since they aren't really important. The important bit is the percentages of the army compared to everyone else, because I doubt you'll actually be able to achieve this high troop count. And if you actually manage to do it, please touch some grass. Fascism can afford a military that is 782% bigger than communism's and 320% more than democracy's. That's kinda nutty. Actually scrap that. It's very nutty. And that's just the economic part. Let's go over the topic of skill issue. No, I'm not saying you're bad at the game unless you are feeling really quirky and main liberalism. You crazy individual. No, the thing I want to focus on is which is the most forgiving and best to start with as a new player. There's no difference between a toddler with a rock and a new superpower player. They will both die with one push. And this is why democracy isn't really the best in this aspect. I mean, you get punished for every single action you take if you declare war. Well, screw you. You get a stability decrease. You wanna build an army? Well, screw you. You get increased military upkeep. You wanna be democracy? Well, screw you. You gotta go through liberalism, which is the worst ideology in the game. And this is why it will be between fascism and communism once again. Anyways, between the two, fascism is so much easier to play than communism. As communism, you gotta manage your political power for the best policies, get good research so your economy doesn't get fucked up, you need to keep building factories to keep staying relevant, tanks are way too expensive, so you gotta go with infantry and manage your doctrines. Navy will also be pretty expensive for you, so you need to find a good cohesion with that and artillery, so yeah, no, this is not exactly beginner friendly. Fascism, on the other hand, you click this button, then this, then you build factories, and then you select all cities and spam tanks. Profit. Okay, it's a lot more complicated than that. It's a gross oversimplification. The important part is that you don't fall into debt, which can be devastating for new players. I remember myself falling into debt several times because I didn't pay attention to the deficit icon pop up. But communism is also good at one thing, not gaining any war exhaustion, so you can try with that, I guess. But I'm guessing you are more interested in knowing which is better for intermediate and experienced players. And yeah, the difference here is kinda huge. Even in the best case scenario, which is Russia having communism and utilizing its resources, it can only get up to 20 million factory income, without mines and resource research. Compare this to all the other ideologies with factory research too, since we all get it in the beginning, due to us being able to sell consumer goods immediately. All the other ideologies can make up to 7.2 million factory income, which is more than a third of what communism is capable of. Communism spent a whopping 3.6 1.05 billion for those 121 factories. Meanwhile, the others only spent 1.3 billion, which means they can spend 1.7 billion more on developing, and when everything is totaled out and accounting for fascism's bonuses, the income is pretty equal. And this is the best case scenario for most decent Russia players, and only Russia players, due to the tungsten controlling how many civilian factories you will be able to build. And as we have gone through before, having an equal income is just a death sentence for communism, since fascism will have more than double the army size. And remember, this is me not giving fascism double the population, even though I said that the fascism player is good and experienced. But okay, let's say Russia also conquers Kazakhstan, a double best case scenario. Well, it's just going to be the same thing over again, every time the population increases by 80 million. And after Kazakhstan, there won't be any easy plus 10 tungsten countries left anymore, meaning that tax income will overwhelm resource income by then. And since I'm going off the basis that both the fascism player and communist player is good at the game, the fascism player will have at minimum double the population of Russia. Also, the reason why I didn't account for mines and resource research is because all the other ideologies can also build mines, and tax income can be increased more than resource research, so it only further proves my point. And remember, this is the best case scenario, which only works for Russia, due to them having plus 10 tungsten. It does not work for China, because they have such a big population that tax is just way better, due to how development is scaled. It becomes worse the more you develop on the same city, which is why the effect wasn't that big in Russia. Now, let's just take a normal scenario for communism that is not Russia, and doesn't have tungsten as a natural resource, which is the majority of countries. It's kinda useless. And all of this is without me accounting for where the hell the billions of money is coming from. If the fascism player is good, they can conquer around 3 small countries every 38 days, which should be more than 225 million from stealing their treasury. And that's about 32 million in positive income every 5 days. I have no idea where communism is getting their money from. Communism's army is more expensive and conquers a lot slower, but sure, I guess. Overall then, what's the best ideology? I would say fascism. It's incredibly good for expansion to get a good population, like twice the amount democracy or communism will be able to get in the same time. It also has the best wartime economy by a long shot, easy integration, and low unrest. The only thing that's really bad about it is the war exhaustion gain compared to communism, but democracy also has the same issue. Based on all of this, fascism is a guaranteed victory if you are playing as an island nation, or if your country is in Africa or the Americas, which takes away like half the world. It's also a pretty easy win if you're playing close to the Mediterranean, Black Sea and Caspian Sea, or just a coastline in general, since it's crazy good at naval combat. But everywhere else, it's going to become a battle of attrition. And this is where communist mains likes to argue that communism is much better because they get a war exhaustion decrease. And while yes, it is true, they do gain a war exhaustion decrease, but not in the way most people think. There's a lot of misinformation being spread about how it's calculated. All ideologies gain the same amount of war exhaustion from losing units, like I'm showing on the screen right now. The difference with communism is that it decreases the war exhaustion shown by minus 0.03 every 5 days. You can see how much it changes every 5 days based on the change amount shown if you hover over the icon. The only other thing that can affect it is government spending, which basically has a little bit over a third of the same effectiveness as the communism ideology, with a minus 0.012 war exhaustion decrease. Let me use an example. Russia is fascism right now and can afford 50,000 tanks, compared to China, which is communist and can only afford 25,000. The difference in army size will depend on where you are in the game, but fascism will always have at least double the army size of communism if they have a similar population, and if the fascism player is good. They both also have around 300 million population. And I know it's saying the fish shit, but that's because I've literally only built tanks. I have not developed or picked any tech/policies except forced labor for dissidents, which makes my economy very weak for both sides. I'm going to give communism the advantage again by letting them entrench and literally not using any of fascism's strengths, like an aircraft carrier, a strong military leader because they went to more wars, and that they should have at least double the population of communism, because that's how it should end up if fascism is a good player, utilizing all its bonuses. So look when we go to war. They both gained the same in their war exhaustion. The only difference is that communism just lost its entire army, and here's where I don't understand where communist main's arguments come from. It will still take 416 days just for 2.5 war exhaustion to go away. Are you playing against incompetent players that just attack you with 1000 tanks every month or something? Communism only benefits from its advantages if the war goes on longer than 2 years, with the same amount of losses that I just showed. So like 50,000 tanks and the war exhaustion reaching 5, where it really matters due to bad events being able to pop up. But even then, those scenarios won't pop up if the population amounts are similar, because communism will lose in the numbers game. So you won't even be able to survive against a fascism player with an equal population. And most fascism players will have double the population. So these scenarios will only pop up if you have a bigger population population than your opponent, but that isn't an advantage of ideology, it is an advantage of you being better at the game. This is also the reason why communism is banned in most events, not that they are better than fascism, but because the rules cater to every aspect that makes communism good, and restricting everything that makes fascism good. Unit limits, which doesn't allow fascism or democracy to utilize its advantage in numbers, banning aircraft carriers and restricting navy, which is again one of the main strengths of fascism, not letting people expand, again one of the main advantages of fascism, and all of this just leads to the events being performed on so minuscule front lines that you can just spam forts and just camp with artillery. If you attack, you will lose, so defending is better, which fascism is not really good at, because the longer the war goes on, the worse it is, which makes communism the second best overall best ideology. It has decent potential for expansion and good population, but you need specific countries to use the ideology for its full effect. It's kinda useless with a location with no resources. Communism's goal is to stay away from all coastlines, since democracy and fascism will be wreaking havoc in terms of naval power, but communism excels at infantry spam. But you have to stay out of coastlines, which gives it a very few places to be good at, but it's really good at those places. Overall, a decent ideology. I just think fascism is better, and the only thing communism has going for it is just resources. Sure, communism can get 1 million consumer goods, but they can't actually use those. 1 consumer good is the same as 10 million, they both give 25% stability, so yeah. Which leaves one ideology left. Democracy. Calling democracy the worst overall ideology is really doing it disservice, to be honest, since it may suck on a one-to-one confrontation, but it's a fucking King Kong and the best when it comes to economy outside of war. And that's why democracy is best paired up with fascism or communism, which can take the brunt force of all the combat and sacrifice the men while you just pay them money. Sounds oddly familiar. Use democracy mostly for events where you don't actually partake in the combat, and use them in public service for liberation wars, I guess, if you like ruining other people's days. And that should be it. Oh my god, this video is kinda long. And this is still me not having accounted for like every literal argument. There are still a lot more that I have not covered over, but I prefer to keep them in the comments. So state your thoughts and I'll just comment and respond on why I think that is bad or good. Like how I didn't touch on fascism having a much bigger tax income the further you go in the game. At the beginning it's only 4% due to how the percent is calculated, and the bigger and more tax research you get, the bigger the difference, until it's gonna be around more than 20% more tax income for fascism compared to communism. I've been gone for a while now, I apologize. I should return now, hopefully. I don't know. Fuck.